I heard them decide my fate through a door that wasn't fully closed. The sound was a low conspiratorial murmur, the words themselves less important than the tone of finality that seeped through the sliver of open air, a chilling draught that had nothing to do with the autumn evening. My father's voice was a weak, reedy thing, full of apology and resignation. My stepmother's was the sharp, decisive snap of a purse clasp, or metallic certainty and cold transaction. They were speaking of the Duke of Beaumont, a name that in our corner of the world was synonymous with immense wealth, crushing power, and a sorrow so profound it had apparently frozen the man's heart into a perpetual winter. And they were speaking of a contract, a debt, and a daughter. The daughter was supposed to have been Arabella. My sister, my beautiful, radiant, laughing sister, who was fashioned from sunlight and honey and possessed a spirit as untamable as a wild bird. It was she who had been promised, she whose portrait had been sent, she who was the glittering prize meant to settle our father's catastrophic gambling debts, which were held, like a guillotine blade, in the Duke's unyielding grip. But Arabella, true to her nature, had chosen love over duty. She had eloped 2 nights prior with a penniless cavalry officer, leaving behind nothing but a hastily scrawled note and the smouldering ruins of our family's last hope. That left me, Eleanor, the second daughter, the plain one, the quiet one, the one who lived more vividly in the pages of books than in the drawing rooms where my stepmother paraded Arabella. I was not made of sunlight, I was composed of shadow and ink and silence. My value had always been measured in my invisibility, my talent for fading into the wallpaper so as not to detract from my sister's brilliance. Now, in a breathtaking turn of fortune, my very existence had become the family's sole remaining asset. I was the substitute offering, the unlovely lamb to be led to the ducal altar to appease the wolf at our door. When they summoned me, I entered the room with the quiet composure that had long been my only shield. My stepmother, Beatrice, did not bother with pleasantries. Her eyes, the colour of faded periwinkles, swept over me with a familiar, weary disappointment before hardening with resolve. "Eleanor," she began, her voice crisp, "as you know, your sister has seen fit to disgrace us all. She has abandoned her duty. That duty now falls to you." My father, a ghost in his own study, could not meet my gaze. He stared into the empty hearth, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a shame he was all too willing to shift onto mine. "The Duke of Beaumont holds our ruin in his hands," Beatrice continued. "All of this," she gestured vaguely at the threadbare grandeur of our home, "will be forfeit if the contract is not honoured. You will marry him." There was no question, no room for appeal. It was a statement of fact as immutable as the turning of the earth. I was to be sent ahead to his northern estate, Blackwood Manor, a place of grim repute, there to await his arrival and the consummation of our family's desperate bargain. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the placid stillness of a pond's surface after a stone has been dropped into its depths. The ripples of shock were already subsiding, leaving behind a cold, clear certainty. I had always known my life was not entirely my own, but I had never imagined it would be sold so brazenly. I nodded once, a small, spare movement. "I understand." My voice was steady, a fact that seemed to both surprise and irritate my stepmother. She had perhaps hoped for tears, for hysterics. I had none left to give. I had spent them all in the quiet, lonely nights of my girlhood, mourning a life I knew. Even then, I was not destined to lead. The Duke of Beaumont arrived 3 days later to inspect the replacement goods. His reputation had preceded him like an outrider, painting a portrait of a man carved from granite and grief. They said he had loved his first intended a celebrated beauty with a singular, all-consuming passion, and her sudden death from a fever years ago had extinguished any light within him. He was now a creature of duty and commerce, his heart a locked and bolted room. When he was shown into our drawing-room, the air grew colder, thinner. He was taller than I had imagined, with a severe, handsome face that looked as though it had forgotten how to smile. His eyes were the colour of a stormy sea, and they held no warmth, only a piercing, analytical intelligence. The meeting was a masterpiece of social agony. Beatrice fawned and flattered, her voice a syrupy confection that I could see immediately repelled him. My father mumbled a few incoherent pleasantries before retreating into his customary silence. I stood by the window, a book held tightly in my hands, a prop to anchor me in the swirling currents of my own humiliation. I was presented to him not as a future bride, but as a piece of property being transferred. I expected a cursory glance, a dismissive nod, perhaps a flicker of contempt for the poor quality of the substitute, but that is not what happened. He turned his head and his gaze met mine. It was not a glance, not the polite, sweeping assessment one gives to a room's furnishings, but a direct, focused, and unnervingly thorough look. His eyes catalogued me, from the simple brown braid of my hair to the worn cover of the book in my hands. They lingered for a fraction of a second on my fingers, and I was suddenly, mortifyingly aware of the small smudge of ink on my index finger, a telltale sign of my morning's escape into prose. Most men looked at me and saw nothing. The Duke of Beaumont looked at me and saw everything. It was a clinical, dispassionate inventory, yet it was the most profound act of being seen I had ever experienced. A faint, almost imperceptible frown line appeared between his brows. He looked from my face to my father, then back to me. The room held its breath. "She will suffice," he said at last, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. The words were a cold dismissal, an insult wrapped in acceptance. Yet, in the strange, unsettling privacy of that gaze, I had felt something else, a flicker of what? Curiosity, annoyance, I could not name it. But it was the first crack in the monolith of his reputation, and the first fissure in my own carefully constructed resignation. My journey north was a lonely, rattling affair. I was dispatched with little ceremony, my belongings packed into a single trunk, my future sealed. Blackwood Manor rose from the mist-shrouded moors like a jagged tooth, a fortress of dark stone and shadowed windows. It was vast and imposing, a physical manifestation of its master's soul. I was not taken to the main house. Instead, I was escorted to a small, derelict cottage on the edge of the estate, a place clearly meant for a retired groundskeeper or a disgraced relation. The rooms were cold, the hearth was swept clean of ash, and a damp chill clung to the very walls. It was a clear, calculated message. I was not a guest, not yet a duchess. I was merely cargo stored away until needed. The isolation was absolute. The staff of the main house kept their distance, their movements spectral and silent. The housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Breener, Gable with a face as stern as a Puritan's sermon, brought me meals on a tray. Her expression unreadable. In those first few days I felt the cold seep into my bones, a slow creeping despair that threatened to extinguish the small flame of resilience I had so carefully nurtured. I spent my hours reading, walking the overgrown, tangled paths around the cottage, and staring into the empty fireplace, wondering if I would simply freeze, body and soul, before the Duke even returned. Then, one evening, a change. I heard the rumble of a cart and the low voices of men. Peeking through the grimy window pane, I saw 2 estate workers unloading a massive quantity of split, seasoned firewood, stacking it neatly beside my cottage door. There was no note, no explanation. The next morning, laid carefully across the back of the single rickety chair on my small porch, was a shawl. It was not fancy, but it was made of the thickest, softest wool, the colour of deep moss, and it radiated a warmth that felt like a benediction. 2 days after that, a wooden crate appeared. Inside, nestled in straw, were books. Not the frivolous novels my stepmother favoured, but volumes of philosophy, of history, of agricultural theory, the very subjects I had once mentioned in passing during that brief terrible interview were the province of the book I had been holding. My first thought was Mrs. Gable, a secret kindness from a stern exterior. But the selection of books was too specific, too attuned to the ink-stained girl by the window. The shawl was a practical thought, yes, but the sheer quality of it spoke of an order given, not an item taken from a linen press. A slow, dawning, and deeply unsettling realization began to form in my mind. These were not random acts. They were commands issued from a distance. He was not here, but he was watching. The Duke of Beaumont, the cold and distant man of business, was tending to his investment, ensuring the collateral did not perish from the cold before the contract could be fulfilled. The thought was both comforting and profoundly chilling. He arrived a fortnight later without fanfare. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, more charged, with his presence on the estate. I expected a summons to the grand house, another formal, humiliating interview. Instead, he found me in the cottage's neglected garden, where I was attempting to coax a few stubborn, late-blooming roses back to life. He simply appeared at the end of the path, a tall, dark figure against the grey sky, watching me. "The roses have been neglected," he said. It was not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. "They are resilient," I replied, not looking up from my task, my heart hammering against my ribs. "They only require a little attention." Our conversations began, like that in spare, clicked sentences conducted on the neutral territory of the gardens and the moors. We walked, always with a respectable distance between us, the vast, empty landscape our only chaperone. He confounded all my expectations. He did not speak of society, or fashion, or the tedious gossip that formed the bedrock of drawing-room discourse. He asked about the books. He pointed out features of the land, explaining the intricacies of crop rotation and sheep husbandry with a surprising deep-seated passion. He spoke of the estate not as a source of income, but as a living entity, a legacy to be nurtured. He began to invite me to the library in the main house. It was clearly his sanctuary, a magnificent, two-story room panelled in dark wood, smelling of leather and old paper and beeswax. Here, surrounded by the silent companionship of thousands of volumes, the distance between us began to shrink. We would sit for hours often, in comfortable silence, reading. Then a passage would spark a question would ignite a debate, and a debate would soften into a shared exploration of ideas. I saw the man behind the ducal mask, the sharp, inquisitive mind, the dry, ironic wit that surfaced in rare, startling flashes. And I felt him seeing me, Eleanor, not the plain substitute, but a mind that could meet his own. I began to feel a treacherous warmth unfurling in my chest, a fragile hope I dared not name. One afternoon, he showed me a medieval manuscript he had recently acquired, its pages illuminated with brilliant gold and lapis lazuli. He laid it carefully on a velvet cushion on the large library table, his long, elegant fingers tracing the delicate scroll work. "The artistry is remarkable," he murmured, his voice lower than usual. I leaned closer to see, my senses filled with the scent of old parchment and the faint, clean smell of the soap he used. As I reached out to point to a particularly intricate detail in the margin, my fingers brushed against his. The contact was a lightning strike, a jolt of pure, unadulterated shock that shot up my arm and seemed to stop my very breath. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental touch, yet it felt more significant than any embrace I could have imagined. We both recoiled as if burned. The air in the vast, silent library suddenly became thick and heavy, charged with everything we had so meticulously left unsaid. His stormy eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw not cold analysis, but a raw, unguarded emotion I could not decipher. It was confusion and something deeper, something that looked almost like alarm. The silence stretched, taut and shimmering, until I could bear it no longer. I mumbled an excuse and fled, my cheeks flaming, my entire being thrumming with the aftershock of that single, momentous touch. For days afterward, a new tension defined our interactions. The easy companionship in the library was replaced by a watchful, brittle formality. We were both acutely aware of a line that had been crossed, a door that had been opened into a room neither of us was prepared to enter. I was certain I had ruined everything, that my involuntary response had reminded him of the chasm between us, the powerful Duke and the penniless girl who was his property. I retreated to my cottage, to my solitude, preparing myself for the inevitable return of the cold. He came to me a week later, as I was leaving the library, after returning a book. He stood in the great hall, blocking my path to the door. "Eleanor," he said, and the sound of my given name, spoken without a title in that resonant voice, was as startling as a shout in a church. I stopped, my hand on the doorknob. "Tomorrow," he continued, his gaze intense and unwavering, "I will be inspecting the north pasture. I find the conversation there lacking. Will you walk with me?" He paused, and the next word was delivered with a quiet, deliberate weight that made it feel like a vow. Alistair. He was asking me to use his name. It was a breach of every conceivable protocol, a dismantling of the formal wall that separated a duke from a mere miss. It was an invitation not to an inspection of land, but to an inspection of a shared future. It was the most terrifying and exhilarating question I had ever been asked, and in the quiet of that grand, echoing hall, I found my voice. "Yes," I whispered. "Alistair." The fragile blossom of this new understanding was trampled just as it began to open. My aunt, my mother's sister, and the only member of my family who had ever shown me consistent kindness, sent her son to check on my welfare. Davies Thomas was everything the Duke was not. He was fair-haired and smiling, his manner open and easy, his conversation filled with cheerful nonsense and uncomplicated warmth. He arrived at Blackwood like a ray of unexpected sunshine, full of concern for my well-being and outrage at the state of my cottage. He spent 2 days with me, and for the first time in months, I felt a simple, uncomplicated lightness. We walked in the gardens, and he told me ridiculous stories of his time at university, his humour gentle and teasing. Sitting on a stone bench, surrounded by the scent of damp earth and late roses, he said something so absurdly funny that a laugh escaped me. It was not a polite titter, but a genuine, bubbling, unrestrained laugh, a sound of pure, unburdened joy that felt alien in my own throat. It was in that moment, with the echo of my own happiness still in the air, that I glanced up at the main house. And I saw him, Alistair. He was standing at the tall window of the library, a dark, motionless silhouette against the light, watching us. I could not see his expression, but the rigid stillness of his posture spoke volumes. It radiated a cold, focused intensity that chilled me to the bone, instantly extinguishing the warmth of my laughter that night. He came to my cottage. He did not knock. He simply opened the door and stepped inside, his presence filling the small, cramped room, sucking all the air from it. His face was a thunderous mask, his eyes glacial. In his hand he held a sheaf of papers. "I believe it is time we clarified the terms of our arrangement," he said, his voice dangerously soft. He strode to the small table and laid the documents down. It was the marriage contract. I stared at it, my blood turning to ice. There at the top was Arabella's name, violently struck through with a slash of black ink beneath it. In a different, harsher script was mine, Eleanor Finchwood. The sight of it was a physical blow. He had brought the very instrument of my sale into this space where a fragile trust had begun to grow. He intended to explain, I think, to finally lay all the cards upon the table, but his timing, fueled by a jealousy he could not articulate, was catastrophic. My eyes scanned the dense legal text, catching on phrases and clauses, until one sentence leaped out from the page, branding itself onto my mind. It stated, in cold, unequivocal terms, that should the marriage to a daughter of Lord Finchwood fail to be solemnised for any reason, all lands, properties, and titles belonging to the Finchwood estate would be immediately and irrevocably forfeit to the Duke of Beaumont. The world tilted on its axis, the firewood, the shawl, the books, the conversations about philosophy, the shared silences in the library, the brushing of our fingers, his name, every kindness, every moment of connection was instantly and sickeningly reframed. It was not a courtship, it was risk management. He had not been nurturing a person. He had been protecting an asset. He had been ensuring his collateral was in good health, mentally and physically, so that the contract could be executed and his true prize, my family's lands which bordered his own to the south, could be secured. The laughter in the garden with Thomas must have looked to him like a threat to the investment. A wave of nausea and a white-hot, searing rage washed over me. The quiet, compliant girl was gone, burned away in the fire of this ultimate betrayal. I looked up at him, and for the first time he saw not a trace of fear or deference in my eyes. Was any of it real? I asked, my voice shaking with a fury I had never known I possessed. The books? The walks? Or am I merely another line item on your ledger? Your Grace, a particularly fragile piece of property that required careful handling. He looked genuinely stunned, as if I'd struck him. He opened his mouth to speak, but I was not finished. You did not see a woman in a garden today. I spat. You saw your investment depreciating. You saw a rival bidder making an offer. Eleanor, no, he started, taking a step toward me. Do not, I warned, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Do not use my name. It is not yours to use. It is not part of the purchase price. The shock on his face gave way to a dawning horror as he realized how I had interpreted his actions. He looked at the contract on the table as if it were a venomous snake. The contract was business, he said, his voice raw. A means to an end. Everything else. You. He struggled for words, his own iron control fracturing. You were a catastrophe I did not plan for, but his confession, raw as it was lost in the roar of my pain. The trust I had, so tentatively placed in him, was shattered into 1,000 pieces. I turned my back on him, presenting him with a shoulder as cold and unyielding as any wall he had ever built around himself. Please leave, I said, my voice hollow. I need to consider the terms of my servitude. I heard him hesitate, a sharp intake of breath, and then the sound of his footsteps retreating, the soft click of the door closing behind him, leaving me alone in the ruins. In the days that followed, a profound and desolate silence descended. I did not leave the cottage. Mrs. Gable continued to bring my meals, her expression now tinged with a pity that was almost harder to bear than her previous stoicism. I did not read the books he had given me felt like poison, their pages filled with lies. I waited. I was a prisoner, awaiting my sentence, and I felt nothing but a vast, empty numbness. Then came a letter, not from the Duke, but from my aunt, delivered by a frantic messenger. It was a warning. Beatrice, my stepmother, having heard no news of a wedding and likely suspecting that her leverage was weakening, was on her way to Blackwood. She intended to resolve the matter, which I knew meant she would arrive like a tempest, ready to force the marriage, humiliate me, and assert her control over the entire situation. Her arrival would be the final, unbearable turn of the screw. The news should have terrified me. Instead, it stirred something from the ashes of my despair, a single, defiant ember of anger. I would not be a pawn in her game. Not anymore. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Alistair came again. He looked haggard, as if he had not slept in days. He did not try to enter the cottage, but stood on the threshold, a man seeking admittance to a place he had desecrated. He held no papers, only a profound weariness in his eyes. "She is coming," I stated flatly, leaving no doubt as to whom I meant. "I know," he said. "My solicitor is already on his way from London. He will be here by morning." His proactive defence, his readiness for battle on my behalf, was a gesture I noted with a flicker of something other than contempt. He did not try to make excuses. He simply began to speak, his voice low and devoid of its usual ducal authority, stripped down to the raw confession of a man laid bare. "Before you, Eleanor, my life was an orderly, predictable affair. It was governed by duty, by loss, and by the conviction that I was incapable of feeling anything ever again. Years ago, I loved a woman, or rather, I loved an idea of a woman. When she died, I did not grieve a person. I grieved the future I had planned. It was neat, contained. I encased my heart in ice and believed it was a fortress. I thought a marriage of convenience, a cold transaction to secure my borders, was the only sort of union I was fit for. He looked at me then, and the pain in his eyes was so real, so profound, it stole my breath. "I did not plan for your mind, which is sharper and quicker than my own. I did not plan for your quiet strength, which is more formidable than any army. I did not plan," his voice cracked slightly, "for the sound of your laughter in a sunlit garden, a sound that made me realize my entire world had been silent for a decade. You were not a catastrophe, Eleanor. You were the cataclysm that shattered the ice. You have unmade me." He took a shaky breath. "The contract is meaningless. The debt is an abomination that I have used to wound you. My solicitor is not coming to enforce it. He is coming with a document that cancels your father's debt in its entirety. It is done. You are free, Eleanor. Your family is free. Whether you choose to walk away from Blackwood forever, or whether you choose to stay. The choice is yours, and yours alone, unfettered, unconditional." He was forgiving a fortune. He was relinquishing all power, all leverage, all claims. He was setting me free at immense personal cost, with no guarantee of my response. It was an act so absolute, so irrefutable, that it bypassed all my defences and struck directly at my heart. The kindness of the books and the shawl had been ambiguous, but this was a truth as solid and real as the ground beneath my feet. In his vulnerability I saw his honour. In his sacrifice I saw his love. The key, which I hadn't even known was there, turned in a lock deep inside me. Tears I had refused to shed for myself now welled in my eyes for him, for the lonely, frozen man who had finally found a sun warm enough to melt him. "You should have led with that," I whispered, a ghost of a smile touching my lips, a flicker of hope, brilliant and dazzling, ignited in his eyes. He took a hesitant step into the room. He did not need to ask the question. He simply waited. And I, who had been a substitute, a payment, a piece of collateral, finally made a choice for myself. I stepped forward and closed the door behind him. My stepmother arrived the next afternoon precisely as expected. In a flurry of outrage and expensive, travel-worn silk, she swept into the main drawing-room of Blackwood Manor as if she were its mistress, her lawyer, a small, weasel-faced man, trailing in her wake. I stood by the fireplace, Alistair at my side. He was once again the formidable Duke, calm and unassailable, but this time I felt his strength as a shield around me, not a cage. "Well," Beatrice exclaimed, her eyes flicking between us with venomous speculation, "I have come to see this sordid business," concluded the wedding, "will take place by special licence before the week is out. Any further delay is unacceptable." She delivered her ultimatum with the air of a conquering general. Alistair let the silence hang for a moment before nodding to a gentleman standing discreetly by the door. "Lady Finchwood, allow me to present my solicitor, Mr. Harding. He has a document that may be of interest to you." Mr. Harding stepped forward and, with a cool professionalism that was a delight to witness, presented my stepmother's lawyer with a single crisp sheet of parchment. The weasel-faced man read it, his eyes widening. He read it again, then looked at Beatrice, his expression one of pure panic. "My lady," he stammered, This is a deed of cancellation. The Duke has forgiven all of Lord Finchwood's debts in full. It has been filed and witnessed. There is no contract. There is no leverage." The colour drained from Beatrice's face. For a moment she was speechless. Then, her plans in ashes, she turned the full force of her fury on me. "You!" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "You did this, you plain, scheming little nobody. You wormed your way in. You seduced him with your pathetic, bookish ways. I should have locked you in the attic and left you there to rot." In the past, those words would have withered me. I would have shrunk, bent, and broken under their weight, but I was not that person anymore. I stood tall, and I met her gaze without flinching, my voice clear and steady in the silent room. "You are wrong," I said, with a calm that felt like a revelation. "You saw me only as a pawn to be moved, a price to be paid." He, and I glanced at Alistair, whose hand had found mine, his fingers lacing through my own, saw a person to be valued. That is the only difference that has ever mattered. My life is my own now, Beatrice, and you have no place in it. Her defeat was absolute, stripped of her power, her ambition reduced to nothing. She seemed to shrink before our eyes. She was just a bitter, grasping woman, with nothing left to grasp. Alistair made a small, sharp gesture to the butler, and with a quiet, terrifying finality, my stepmother was shown the door. The great drawing-room, which moments before had been a battlefield, was now profoundly still. The echo of the slammed door faded, leaving only the sound of our breathing and the crackle of the fire. Alistair turned to me, his stormy eyes soft with an emotion so deep, it felt as though I could fall into it and never find the bottom. The tension of the past weeks, the fear, the betrayal, the confrontation, it all dissolved in that one long look. He did not speak. He did not need to. He raised my hand to his lips, his gaze never leaving mine, and then he closed the distance between us. His other hand came up to cup my face, his touch infinitely gentle, as if he were holding the most precious, fragile thing in the world. And then he kissed me. It was not a kiss of frantic passion or triumphant possession. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was slow and deep, and shaking with the weight of all the words we had never said. It was the taste of relief, the feel of a promise, the silent, sacred vow of a future beginning in that very moment. It was everything. We were married 3 months later at the turning of the year, when the first snows were dusting the moors in a blanket of pristine white. Blackwood Manor was no longer a fortress of solitude, but a home filled with the warmth of roaring fires and the quiet contentment of shared lives. The library became the heart of our world, a place not of escape, but of connection. My intelligence, once a liability, was now my greatest asset. I was not merely the Duchess of Beaumont, I was Alistair's partner in all things. My opinions on tenets and treatises sought and valued, my presence at his side an undisputed fact. A letter eventually arrived from Arabella, postmarked from a small, happy corner of the world. She wrote of her joy, her love for her cavalry officer, and her profound relief that I, her quiet, overlooked sister, had found a happiness more grand and more suited to me than any she could have imagined for herself. One afternoon I saw Mrs. Gable watching us as Alistair, and I stood by the library window, heads bent together over an estate map. A small, genuine smile touched her stern lips, a rare and precious sight that felt like a final benediction. Tonight I sit in a worn leather armchair by the fire, a book resting unread in my lap. Alistair is across from me, his head bent over some paperwork, the firelight catching the silver strands at his temples. He looks up as if feeling my gaze, and his severe face softens into a smile that is reserved only for me. In that look, I see my entire world. I once believed my life would be defined by being unheard, unseen, a footnote in my own story. But it was in that quiet, overlooked space that I learned to listen to my own heart. And it was by being truly seen by one man who had the patience to look past the surface that I found not just a great love, but my own unassailable worth. I had come to Blackwood as a payment, but I had stayed as its treasure. I was, finally, irrevocably, home. Have you ever waited for words that were slow to come, only to find they were more precious for the silence that came before them? The journey from being an object of a contract to the subject of a confession was a long and quiet one, but every step was worth the destination. Let me know in the comments below about a time when patience revealed a deeper truth to you. What was your favourite moment in Eleanor and Alistair's story? Was it the secret kindness of the books, or the final confrontation with her stepmother? If you found yourself lost in the halls of Blackwood Manor and the quiet unfolding of this love story, please consider giving this video a like to let me know. Sharing it with a friend who appreciates a tale of quiet strength and earned happiness would mean the world to me. And of course, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for more stories of hearts that find their way home, often when they least expect it. Thank you for spending your time with me today. I shall see you in the next one.